Picture this. You're racing down a dark mountain road at midnight. Adrenaline pumping through your veins as your speedometer climbs past 80, 90, pushing 100 miles per hour. When suddenly you glance in your rearview mirror and freeze because there's someone sitting in your back seat who wasn't there 5 seconds ago. Someone who doesn't move, doesn't speak, just stares with eyes that seem to reflect something ancient and terrible. How did they get there? What do they want? And here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. What if I told you this exact scenario has happened to dozens of teenagers racing along one particular stretch of highway known as Deadman's Curve, where the laws of physics bend just enough to let something slip through? Tonight's story comes from 3 teenagers who thought they were just looking for a cheap thrill, a way to prove themselves against the legendary curve that claimed 17 lives in the past decade alone. But what they discovered sitting silently in their back seats would change everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between our world and whatever lies beyond. The locals warned them about racing that stretch of asphalt after dark, told them about the others who'd seen the figure, about cars found wrapped around trees with no explanation for why the drivers suddenly veered off the road. But teenage bravado has a way of dismissing old wives' tales until you're doing 120 around that infamous bend and realize with crystalline clarity that some warnings exist for reasons we're not meant to fully understand. The most terrifying part isn't seeing the figure in your mirror. It's the moment you turn around to look directly at the back seat and find it empty, only to check the mirror again and see them still sitting there, waiting, watching, existing in some impossible space between reflection and reality. And that's when you understand why they call it Deadman's Curve. Not for those who died there, but for what death left behind. If this sends chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button because the road ahead gets much darker. Marcus had been the one to suggest it, of course. Leaning against his beat-up Challenger in the school parking lot with that cocky grin that made him think he was invincible. Telling Jake and Emma that tonight was the night they'd finally prove the old-timers wrong about Deadman's Curve. That all those stories were just small-town superstition meant to keep kids from having fun. The 3 of them had grown up hearing the whispers, knew every detail about the 17 crashes, could recite the names of the victims like some morbid catechism. But sitting in Marcus's car as they approached the base of the mountain, the bravado that had seemed so solid in daylight began to crack like ice under pressure. Emma rode shotgun, her fingers drumming nervously against her thigh, while Jake sat in the back filming everything on his phone, saying they'd be legends at school tomorrow. But none of them mentioned how the temperatures seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment they turned onto Old Mountain Highway, or how the radio started picking up static that sounded almost like breathing. The road stretched ahead like a serpent's spine, twisting upward through dense forest that pressed in from both sides. And Marcus pushed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring its challenge to whatever might be listening, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour as they climbed toward that infamous curve where physics supposedly forgot its own rules. Jake was the first to notice it, his camera still rolling when he caught something in the viewfinder that made his blood turn to ice water. A shape in the reflection of the rear window that shouldn't be there. Couldn't be there because they'd all watched each other get in the car and nobody else had joined them. But there it sat, perfectly still, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wanted to turn around, to confirm with his own eyes what the camera was showing. But something primal in his brain screamed at him not to, that some things weren't meant to be looked at directly. So instead, he whispered Marcus's name just as they hit the approach to Deadman's Curve, doing 105. Emma saw it next in the passenger side mirror, her scream catching in her throat as she watched the figure's head slowly turn toward her reflection, its features obscured by shadows that moved independently of the car's motion. And she grabbed Marcus's arm just as the curve appeared ahead, like the mouth of some massive beast. The Challenger's tires screamed against asphalt as Marcus fought to maintain control, the speedometer still climbing despite his foot easing off the gas, 110, 115. And in that moment of pure terror, all three of them saw it clearly in every reflective surface. The figure that existed only in mirrors and glass, patient and eternal, waiting for them to make the same mistake 17 others had made before them. Marcus yanked the wheel hard to the right at the last possible second, the Challenger's rear end sliding sideways as they entered Deadman's curve at an impossible angle. Tires smoking against the asphalt, while the figure in the mirrors remained perfectly still, unaffected by the violent motion that threw the teenagers against their seats. The speedometer was stuck at 120 now, the needle trembling like it was fighting against some invisible force. And Marcus pumped the brakes, but nothing happened, the pedal going straight to the floor as they rocketed around the curve's deadly arc. Jake's phone flew from his hands, clattering somewhere in the back, but he didn't dare reach for it, because turning around meant potentially seeing what sat beside him in three-dimensional space. And every instinct screamed that doing so would be the last mistake he'd ever make. Emma was hyperventilating, her eyes locked on the passenger mirror where the figure's reflection had started to change, its shadowy form becoming clearer with each passing second, revealing features that weren't quite human, weren't quite anything that belonged in this world, just wrong in ways that made her mind refuse to process the details. The curve seemed to stretch forever, defying the geography they all knew by heart, extending into an impossible spiral that should have sent them plummeting off the cliff, but instead kept them locked in its grip. And Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't driving anymore. They were being driven, pulled along by something that had been waiting here since long before the road was built. The temperature in the car dropped so fast, their breath came out in clouds, frost spreading across the inside of the windows, except for perfect circles around each mirror, as if something wanted to make sure they could still see their passenger clearly. Jake finally found his voice, screaming at Marcus to do something, anything. But Marcus's hands were frozen to the wheel, his foot locked on the useless brake pedal, while the figure in the mirrors began to lean forward, moving for the first time since it had appeared. Emma saw it reach toward them in the reflection, its hand passing through the barrier between mirror and reality, fingers of shadow stretching into the front seat. And she understood with terrible clarity that this was how the others had died. Not from losing control, but from seeing something that broke their minds completely. The engine was screaming now, revving beyond its mechanical limits, the dashboard lights flickering in patterns that almost looked like words in a language that predated human speech. And just when it seemed like the car would tear itself apart from the strain, Jake did the only thing he could think of and closed his eyes, shouting at the others to do the same. In that darkness behind their eyelids, they heard it speak for the first and only time. A voice like wind through a cemetery, telling them they had passed the test that 17 others had failed, that they had refused to look directly at what shouldn't be seen. And suddenly the engine went quiet, the speedometer dropped to 0, and they found themselves parked on the shoulder just past Deadman's curve, the figure gone from every mirror as if it had never existed at all. They sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, none of them willing to speak or move, afraid that acknowledging what had just happened would somehow invite it back. Until finally, Emma noticed something that made her stomach drop. There were 4 cell phones lighting up on the dashboard, not 3. The 4th phone, an old flip model that looked like it hadn't been manufactured in over a decade, displayed a single text message that read, "Thank you for not looking," followed by 17 names. And Jake recognized them immediately as the victims who died on Deadman's Curve over the years, their names appearing one by one before vanishing like smoke. Marcus finally managed to restart the engine with shaking hands, the Challenger roaring to life as if nothing had happened. But when he adjusted the rearview mirror, he saw that the back seat wasn't empty anymore. Instead, there were subtle impressions in the leather, the kind that form when someone sits in the same spot for a very long time. And the outline was still warm to the touch when Jake reluctantly reached back to check. They drove back toward town in complete silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced. But as they passed under the first street light, Emma noticed their reflections in the windows looked wrong, like they were slightly out of sync with their movements, lagging behind by just a fraction of a second that made everything feel disconnected and unreal. The radio suddenly crackled to life on its own, cycling through static until it landed on an AM station they'd never heard before, where a monotone voice was reading what sounded like a traffic report. Except it was describing accidents that hadn't happened yet. Would happen tomorrow, next week, next month. All at Deadman's Curve, all involving teenagers who wouldn't heed the warning they'd been given. Jake grabbed the old flip phone from the dashboard and opened it to find hundreds of photos in its memory. Images of the curve taken from impossible angles, from above, from below, from inside the mountain itself. And in each one there was that same figure, standing, waiting, watching from places no human could reach. And they understood that it had always been there, would always be there, a permanent fixture of that cursed stretch of road. Marcus pulled over again, and they made a pact right there, swearing on everything sacred they could think of that they would never race again, never test fate, never speak of this night except to warn others. But even as they made their promises, they could feel something had changed inside them. Like they'd been marked somehow, chosen to carry this knowledge, whether they wanted it or not. The next morning, when they checked social media, they found dozens of posts from other teenagers planning to race Deadman's Curve that very night, drawn by the same rumors and legends that had pulled them in. And despite their efforts to warn them, their messages appeared corrupted, scrambled into unintelligible symbols that hurt to look at, as if the curve itself was protecting its secrets, ensuring a steady stream of new challengers who would either learn the lesson or become another name on that growing list. 3 days passed before Jake noticed the first change. His reflection in mirrors would sometimes turn its head independently, tracking something behind him that wasn't there. And when he tried to tell Emma and Marcus about it, his voice would distort mid-sentence, words rearranging themselves into warnings about the curve that he hadn't meant to speak. Emma discovered she could no longer drive past any curved road without her hands involuntarily gripping the wheel and her foot lifting off the accelerator, as if some primal part of her brain had been rewired to recognize danger in every bend, while Marcus found himself waking up at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night, the precise time they'd encountered the figure. His room filled with the smell of burning rubber and hot asphalt despite his windows being closed. The old flip phone they'd found had disappeared from Marcus's car, but its photos began appearing in their regular phones galleries, multiplying like a virus, showing not just the curve, but other locations too. Abandoned gas stations, empty motel rooms, desolate stretches of highway where similar figures stood waiting. And they realized with growing horror that Deadman's Curve was just one node in a vast network of places where reality wore thin. When they tried to delete the images, new ones would appear instantly, now showing their own faces superimposed over the previous victims, aging them decades in seconds, showing them possible futures where they never stopped racing, never learned the lesson, never escaped the curve's influence. And in every version, they could see that figure in the background, patient as stone, eternal as the road itself. Emma's younger brother announced he was planning to race the curve with his friends for his 16th birthday. And when she tried to stop him, tried to explain what would happen, her words came out as encouragement instead, her mouth forming syllables she couldn't control, saying things like, "It's just a story," and "Nothing ever really happens there," while her eyes pleaded with him to understand the opposite. They met secretly at Marcus's house to discuss what to do, but found they couldn't enter without first walking counterclockwise around it 3 times, couldn't sit down without arranging their chairs in a perfect triangle, couldn't speak without first checking every reflective surface for that watching presence. These new compulsions as involuntary as breathing, as if they'd been infected with some kind of supernatural OCD that grew stronger each day. The local news reported a sudden decrease in accidents at Deadman's Curve, which should have been good news, except the reporter's eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing. And when she smiled at the camera, they could swear they saw that familiar figure standing behind her in the studio. And they understood that it wasn't protecting the road out of kindness, but cultivating it like a garden, allowing just enough survivors to spread the story, to draw in new prey, to keep the legend alive and feeding. Jake suggested they go back one more time, not to race, but to try to understand, to find some way to break whatever hold the curve had on them. But even as he said it, he could feel the wrongness of the idea, the way it pulled at something deep in his chest. And he knew with terrible certainty that the curve was calling them back, that they would return whether they wanted to or not, that they were part of its story now, forever linked to that dark stretch of asphalt where physics bent and shadows had weight, and something ancient waited patiently for the next group of teenagers who thought they were invincible. The return to Deadman's Curve happened on a Tuesday night when none of them had planned it, each receiving a text from an unknown number containing only coordinates and a time. And despite every rational thought screaming against it, they found themselves driving toward that familiar stretch of road as if pulled by invisible threads, their cars converging at the exact spot where everything had started 3 weeks earlier. The asphalt seemed to shimmer under their headlights like water, reflecting not the sky above, but something deeper, darker. And as they parked in formation without discussing it, they noticed other cars already there. Windows tinted black, engines running but producing no sound. And they recognized with sinking dread that these were the vehicles from the old photos, somehow existing simultaneously in past and present. Emma was the first to see him clearly, not in a mirror this time, but standing at the apex of the curve itself, more solid than before, wearing clothes from different decades layered impossibly on top of each other. And when he raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons, every car alarm in the vicinity began blaring in perfect synchronization, creating a rhythm that matched their accelerated heartbeats. Marcus tried to leave, but his car wouldn't start until he faced the curve. And Jake discovered his phone was recording without his input, live streaming to an account he didn't create with thousands of viewers typing comments in languages that hurt to read. Symbols that rearranged themselves into predictions about who would race next, who would survive. who would join the eternal audience that watched from between the frequencies. The figure began walking toward them with movements that seemed to skip frames of reality, appearing closer with each blink, and they could finally see his face clearly. Not one face, but dozens, overlapping like a multiple exposure photograph, each one a teenager who had raced this curve and lost something essential. Not their life, but their ability to ever truly leave. And Emma recognized with nauseating clarity that one of those faces would eventually be hers. They tried to speak to each other, but their words came out as engine sounds, their thoughts manifesting as tire smoke, their fear condensing into droplets of oil on the asphalt that spelled out messages about acceptance, about understanding their new role as recruiters for the curve, about how every legend needs its evangelists to survive across generations. And they finally understood that surviving Deadman's curve didn't mean escaping it, but becoming part of its mechanism, human components in a supernatural engine that fed on the specific frequency of teenage invincibility crashing against cosmic indifference. The other cars began to move, circling them slowly, and through their darkened windows, they could see drivers from different eras, all young, all with that same hollow expression of someone who had touched something beyond normal reality and could never quite return. And as the circle tightened, Jake, Emma, and Marcus felt themselves beginning to synchronize with this ghostly traffic pattern, their hands moving to their keys without conscious thought, their feet finding the pedals with practiced ease, knowing that in moments they would join the eternal race that never truly ended, just paused between victims, between generations, between the beats of a heart that had learned to keep time with something vast and patient and hungry that lived in the angles where the road curved away from reason and into spaces that maps could never quite capture. The engines roared to life in perfect unison, not by their choice, but by the will of something that had been waiting in the curve since long before the road was ever paved. And as they accelerated into formation with the phantom drivers, Jake, Emma, and Marcus felt their individual consciousnesses beginning to blur at the edges, merging with the collective memory of every racer who had ever challenged this stretch of haunted asphalt. The figure at the curve's apex raised both arms now, conducting this symphony of souls and steel, and through their mirrors they could see not just one passenger, but dozens. All the lost racers sitting in impossible layers in their back seats, young faces frozen in that moment between thrill and terror, between life and whatever came after. Emma's hands gripped the wheel as her car reached speeds that shouldn't have been possible on that tight curve. But physics meant nothing here where the road existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And she understood with perfect clarity that they weren't being punished or consumed, but transformed into something essential. Living warnings that would appear in future mirrors. Silent passengers for the next generation of racers who would inevitably come seeking proof that death could be outrun. Marcus felt his foot press harder on the accelerator, even as his mind screamed to brake. And Jake watched his speedometer spin past its maximum reading into impossible numbers that hurt to perceive. And together, they crossed the threshold where Deadman's curve revealed its true nature. Not a place where people died, but where they became eternal, racing forever in the space between seconds, appearing in mirrors to warn or recruit. Depending on perspective, their teenage bravado crystallized into a permanent cautionary tale that would echo through decades of Friday night races and Sunday morning regrets. 3 more names added to the legend that would never die, because it was never truly alive. Just hungry and patient and always waiting for the next set of headlights to pierce the darkness where the road curved away from the world we know and into the one we've always feared exists just beyond our mirrors.